Hello, everyone. In 2012, my husband and I were blessed to join a group of Christians on a cruise from Rome to Egypt and Israel, Turkey, and Greece. Every minute of that trip was amazing. But when we stepped off the ship in Ashdod, Israel, something happened. I immediately realized my feet were walking where Jesus walked. It is impossible to describe how I felt. Suddenly, the Bible became very real. And as we rode our bus into Jerusalem singing the Holy City, tears fell down my cheeks. I would soon step foot in the city of God. Psalms chapter 48, verse 1 tells us Jerusalem is God's holy mountain, the joy of the whole earth. That truth is repeated in Psalm 48, verse 8, 87, verse 3, and Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Jerusalem is the place God calls his own. Psalm 121, verse 4 tells us exactly how much God loves the place he created for his people, the Jews. Quote, "He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." God loves Israel and the Jewish people. Despite all the threats against the country, Israel will prevail in any battle because God said it will. He has promised to watch over it day and night and will send his son Jesus to place his feet on the Mount of Olives one day. Israel will survive forever under God's watchful eye. I hope you understand exactly what I just said. Israel and its now capital city, Jerusalem, is God's pride and joy. It's not simply a little country in the Middle East, but it's God's great love. And the final battle of good and evil will take place on the plains of Megiddo in Israel. What does all this mean then to you and to me? The land of Israel is just a speck in the Middle East. It is only 290 miles long and 85 miles wide, which is about 6 times smaller than Florida. 6 times smaller than Florida. Yet it is constantly spoken of and threatened. Except for Christians, it was given little thought until 1948, when it became a nation. But God said all along he would return his chosen people to Israel. What happened to Israel that it lost its sovereignty as a nation for a while? The Jews disobeyed God, so he allowed the Roman Emperor Hadrian to conquer Jerusalem. Hadrian then sent the Jews packing and changed the name of Israel to Palestine. The land was called Palestine until 1948, when the British, who were then in charge of the country, turned the land over to the Jews, and the United Nations agreed. This fulfilled Bible prophecy. Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 17 says, "I, the Lord, will gather you, the Israelites, from the nations, and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again." That is exactly what God did following World War II. With God's help, the Israelis, once back there, defeated the Palestinians when no one believed they could, and Palestine became Israel once again. Some today believe the country should be divided and the Palestinians should have some of the land. If you believe that, and if you are a Christian, you had better read and reread the Bible. The Palestinians were and are immigrants in a land God created, owns, supports, protects, and more. Christians are required to support Israel. Listen to what happens if you don't. In Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8, we read, quote, "Whoever touches you, Israel, touches the apple of God's eye," end quote. Listen carefully, folks, to what God promises to those who are anti-Israel. Quote, "On that day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem," end quote. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 9. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 12 says, "This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. The wealth of all the surrounding nations will be collected. A similar plague will strike all the animals in those camps." Ezekiel chapter 39, verse 12 says, "For 7 months, the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land." For 7 months. Now, do you really want to stand against Israel? Do you honestly think the United States should do that? Israel will always be God's chosen nation and his chosen people. Gentiles like me received salvation only because Israel was disobedient. God says in Joel chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, "Judah will be inherited forever, and Jerusalem through all generations. Their blood guilt, which I have not pardoned, I will pardon." Did you hear that? The Jews will receive a pardon from God. Romans chapter 11 tells us God loves the Jews still and will save them because to date he has blinded their eyes until the full number of Gentiles are saved. And as verse 28 says, they, the Jews, are loved on account of the patriarchs, and God's gift and his call are irrevocable towards them. In the end, all Jews will be saved. How will God do this? The answer is in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 1. Quote, "On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and iniquity," end quote. Read both Joel chapter 3 and Romans chapter 11 again very carefully. As you have just heard, the Jews are God's chosen people. They will be saved, and we had better support them. President Donald Trump did exactly that on December 6th, 2017, when he not only made Jerusalem, which is the city of God, the capital of Israel, but moved our embassy there. He did what other presidents had agreed to do for years, but didn't. Whether you like President Trump or not, he will one day receive God's reward for what he did. Like him, we are to forever honor and support Israel. Be sure you clearly understand what you just heard. Thanks for listening. This is God's warning to us and all the nations of the world. Quote, "I will curse those who curse Israel," end quote. Choose not to defy God where Israel is concerned. Support that country always. Next week, I will show you the sin of many churches where Israel is concerned. Is your church one of those? I'll let you know next week. See you Thursday.